You guys are just so friendly. I love it. I didn't know if you were gonna like stop talking to each other or if this could go all morning. Hello everyone. Like Jess said, my name is Julie. I'm one of the pastors at the Bellingham CTK, so I am often at the Bellingham campus, though it's the one by the mall. And I have been a part of CTK for 11 years now, which is crazy because if you heard the fullness of my story, I was planning on working at CTK. Well, not at all. And then I got a job as the receptionist there when my husband was in college. And I thought, oh, this is a great little job that'll like pay the bills while he's finishing school. And then we'll leave and do who knows what. We didn't have plans. And now we live 11 years later, and I'm still at CTK. And the Lord has had me stay there. And like I said, I'm one of the pastors now. I oversee our adult ministry team. I actually do some work with the students also, but I get to oversee all of the things that happen that are not weekend services, which is really fun. I really love it. So we also did Alpha last spring, and it was wonderful. So if you haven't done it, or if you have, I do highly recommend that you guys sign up. It's such a great program, but I get to be a part of fun stuff like that all the time. But that means that I'm pretty much stuck at Bellingham and I never get to come places like this. So I'm so happy that we're part of the same network, that Adam was so kind to invite me to be a part of your service today. So I'm really excited to be here. I want you guys to know some things about me so that it doesn't feel like, who is this random stranger standing on the stage? So like I said, I'm at the Bellingham campus. I have been married to my husband, Josh, who's here with me this morning for 11 years. So if you're counting, yes, we have been at CTK 11 years, and we've been married 11 years. We've been in Bellingham 11 years, made a lot of changes in our life 11 years ago. And that was quite the adventure when we were first married, but we're so thankful for it. And we have one sweet doggo. She is named Zoe. She is 4 years old. We got her during COVID when a lot of us were making coping decisions. And I would say having a puppy during an anxious time is maybe not the best thing to do. But we have all survived it. And now she's 4 and she's much calmer, and we're really happy about that. She bites a lot less. And if you had a puppy, you know what I mean. I have definitely taught classes at CTK with scratches on my arm from my dog when she was a puppy. So it's been really cool to see how God has made Whatcom County our home in a way that we didn't plan on, that we get to be here and invest in this community, and we just love it. So it's an honor to be in a different part of Whatcom County with you all this morning. And even though we've already done it, I would love to start in prayer. Lord, thank you so much. Thank you for all you have done in my life and the life of every person in here, the different ways that you move, and the ways that you moved in the story that we're going to look at this morning. God, will your name be the one that is glorified more than anything else that we see today? In your name, amen. One other thing that I failed to mention that I think is important for you to know about me is I am from Southern California. So I grew up in San Diego. San Diego is wonderful. Oh, we have a San Diego fan. I like that. Oh, we got more. Yes. Okay, so if you've ever been there or if you've heard about it, you've probably heard that the weather is great. That is absolutely true. It is wonderful. Although every time my husband visits, it rains. So don't go with him. Other than that, it never rains. It's really beautiful. In the summertime, you're shorts, t-shirt, flip-flops. In the wintertime, it's jeans, sweatshirt, flip-flops. So it's great. And when I grew up there, I went to college there. And after college, I was like, I need to go on a big adventure with my life. I should just go ahead and move to Washington. So I moved up to Washington in late October with my sandals and my one pair of jeans and my hoodie. And it was raining so much, and my toes were always wet. And I was like, I do not understand what is going on in this place. I was cold all of the time. Because if you move up here in late October, it only gets worse. And it only gets darker. And I did not have anything for that. I was woefully unprepared. I was like, wait, you just put on a hoodie and you're still cold? Like, I don't know how to do this. I asked people if I needed an umbrella, and they were like, oh, we don't do that. And I was like, I don't understand why. Like, you just get wet all the time. Like, this is what we do. Like, always kind of damp. Like, and if, like, thank goodness for skinny jeans, because if not, the bottom of your jeans are always, like, wet all the way down. So just, I felt really, like, unprepared for life. Like, I had lived on my own. I was in my mid-20s. I'm like, I can do living in a different state. And I was like, I do not know how to live in a different state. I felt, because the weather was different, it really threw me off. It was wild how much it made me feel like a complete stranger in a strange land. You all don't even know how different Washington is from Southern California, but it really, really is. And now I have like jackets, and you can't tell today, but I do have closed-toed shoes. And I know how to dress and I know how to be in Washington, but for a long time, I felt like a stranger in a strange land. And I think we've probably all felt that way at times, whether we've moved to a whole different place or not. Maybe we've had experiences where we like came into a place for the first time. Maybe you even remember coming into a church for the first time. And you're like, how do I do this? What do I do with my hands? I don't know how to be here. That is normal for all of us. Our world is full of systems that create insiders and outsiders. And so if you've ever had a time when you have felt like an outsider, it's really cool that the Bible has a lot of people who felt that too, and we get to look at their stories. So we're looking at the story of a woman named Ruth, who is the epitome of an outsider. This is a story you find in the first part of the Bible, so the Old Testament. In the Old Testament, the story is primarily about the Israelites. So if you've looked at the Bible, you've seen that. Ruth is not an Israelite, but she has a whole book of the Bible named after her. Ruth is actually from a place called Moab, so she's a Moabite. Ruth is living in Moab and minding her own business. So she's just living her life, not as an Israelite, just hanging out. And a family moves from Bethlehem. They are Israelites, but there's a famine in Bethlehem, and they're like, this is not working. We have no food. And so a couple named Naomi and Elimelech, they have 2 sons, and the 4 of them all move to Moab because there's food in Moab. And when you have no food, food seems like a really great idea. So they leave their city, they leave their cultural heritage, they leave their faith, the place where their God was being worshipped, because they needed to actually live. So they just moved to Moab so they could live. The threat of death was so real that they left. And that wasn't as common then as it is now. It wasn't a society full of people like me who were like, I'm just going to leave where I grew up, no big deal. It wasn't like that then. So it was a very significant choice that they made, but that helps you understand how real the threat of death was. So the boys in this family grow up and they choose to marry Moabite women. Now, if you've studied the Old Testament, you know that that's like a no-no. Like, we don't do that. Israelites don't marry necessarily outside of their culture and their heritage. So they marry these women who are natives of Moab. Again, women minding their own business, but they're like, sure, that sounds great. I'd like to get married. This wasn't actually explicitly illegal. What was interesting was if you married someone outside, if you were an Israelite, and these guys, they married these women from Moab, their next 10 generations could not worship in the house of the Lord. So 10 generations, like, you're like, 10, okay, that's like hundreds of years. So the choice that these guys made, they made a choice for their kids and their kids' kids and their kids' kids and so on for hundreds of years because they made the choice to marry these women from Moab. And so Naomi and Elimelech's sons made this decision for their family. They decided, okay, it's worth it to me to marry these women, and just we'll take the consequences. For whatever reason, they chose that over finding an Israelite woman that would allow them to keep worshiping the Lord. But that meant that Ruth and this other gal, Orpah, they didn't have to be anything other than what they were. Like, the choice had already been made. They couldn't go worship God, so they're like, okay, so I'll just keep being a Moabite. Like, that decision was already made for them. They didn't have to, they didn't have to choose God. They didn't have to worship the God of the Israelites. They didn't have to, look at him at all if they didn't want to. But they just had to deal with the societal norms. And that's a thing that I think is really important for us to talk about. So the societal norms for women weren't really worth a whole lot. So unfortunately, women were more seen as possessions, and the one thing that a woman needed to do was to have sons. She needed to have boy babies. That was so important. If you were a woman, you needed at that time to be successful, to give birth to sons. And if you couldn't do that, you were seen as a problem or lesser or something like that. Turns out, we know now it's not just on the woman if sons aren't born, and it's not just up to a woman to choose the gender. But at that time, women had to bear the burden of that. Well, turns out Ruth and her husband did not have babies. They didn't have sons. They didn't have daughters. No kids for 10 years. Realistically, 10 years of a marriage with no contraception, there should be kiddos. So there was a problem somewhere, and there was no kids. So she would have had to bear the brunt of that. She would be considered the one to blame. And a lot of times guys would leave and find someone else to have their boy babies with, which you see stories of that throughout the Old Testament. But before any choice like that was made, Ruth's husband died. So 10 years, no kids, no husband. And Naomi's husband died, and Orpah's husband died. So now Naomi, who moved with her whole family from Bethlehem to Moab, is a widow, has 2 gals with her who are also widows, and there's no boys. There's no men in this entire family now. That was a very big deal. None of these women would have worth or value to society. They were well, that's a bummer, but these gals are just going to have to live on their own and figure it out. You couldn't necessarily just easily go back to your family, although some families would choose to take you back. But even if a guy was oh, I'd be interested in you. Oh, you've never been able to have kids? I don't think so. There's nothing about Ruth or Orpah that would make them attractive to another guy. So their life, they're pretty much looking at is well, you're going to be a widow forever, with Naomi, also a widow forever, because she's likely too old to have kids. And there's no one to take care of you, because at that point, Naomi would have needed her sons to have had kids that would help take care of them. So 3 gals all by themselves. So Naomi is this is bad. Here I am in a foreign place, and there's no men. I don't know what to do. So Naomi decides, I'm going to go ahead and go back to Bethlehem, because I think that I have a much better chance there of reconnecting, at least with my own people, be back with the Israelites. And so Ruth and Orpah are kind of stuck with her at this point. So they're okay, well, here we go. And I don't think it was an immediate decision. I'm sure it's one they talked about a lot over time. And then as they're going, Naomi is okay, gals, I know you're kind of stuck with me because that's how this whole thing works, but you should go back to your families, because I don't know what there is for you in Bethlehem. I left a long time ago. There was no food at that point. I'm not sure. And so Orpah's bye. And she just went back home, which makes sense. If you think about it, that's the most logical thing to do for a Moabite, right? Why would she go? But Ruth is no, I'm going to go ahead and stay with you, Naomi. I'm going to stay with you. I'm going to keep walking this road that will take her further from everything that she has ever known to where she'll be an outsider, where she's not even supposed to go worship the God that they worship there. We see in Ruth chapter 1, it says, Ruth replied, "Don't urge me to leave you or turn back from you. Where you go, I will go. Where you stay, I will stay. Your people will be my people, and your God, my God. Where you die, I will die, and there I will be buried. May the Lord deal with me, be it ever so severely, if even death separates you and me. So here's Ruth making this decision to go with Naomi. And in it, she says, I think a lot of times we use this verse and we're like, oh, their relationship, their friendship, like that really mattered. But in the middle, it says, your God will be my God. Ruth makes the decision to actually choose the God of the Israelites. Even though there is nothing for Ruth in Bethlehem, there is nothing except for Naomi and God. And for Ruth, she decides that that's enough. For Ruth to say that she is choosing Naomi's God is actually a super big deal. Like I said, that's not the faith tradition that she grew up with. She wouldn't even be allowed into the house of worship, right? And what has she seen of God up to this point? She knows Israelites that had to leave because there was famine, so there's no food. There's homelessness. They're unable to conceive children, and then they died. Like what she's seen on face value of God, for a lot of us, we'd be like, I don't know. Like, I don't know if that's what I would choose. Because God hasn't shown himself to be like the easy path where everything comes together. But Ruth still chose God. Because there is something. There is something in Naomi, the way that she showed her trust in God to go back to Bethlehem, or there was something that her husband had told her about God, or there was something that she had seen in her family, or what she had heard about what God had done for the Israelites. Because up to this point, God had already done a lot of crazy stuff for the Israelites. And so she was like, well, if I have nothing, I think I want to go with God. To be honest, I don't know if I would have done what Ruth did, because what is ahead is unknown, and what is behind is painful, but it's what you know. And I'm totally a person that likes to go with what I know. I'm not big on surprises at all. And Ruth was choosing to be surprised, to see what God would do if she would choose him. She had been worshiping pagan gods up until that time, and she saw something. And she said, yes, I want to choose God. There is something about God that Ruth couldn't deny. And so she went with him. And she broke all the societal rules to do it. And then there she was. She didn't do it probably to gain anything. She didn't think like, if I do this, it's going to be awesome. She just knew and couldn't help but choose God. She chose a relationship with Naomi and God, and that mattered more to her than her personal comfort and going back to the land that she knew. She also probably knew that when she showed up in Bethlehem, she would not be welcomed with open arms. They wouldn't be like, oh, cool, Moabite, come on in. They would very likely just always see her as an outsider, particularly since she couldn't have kids. And so she would always be on the fringes of society, and she still said yes. In that moment that Ruth made that choice, what she also did was actually set forth an entirely different path for all of humanity, and that includes us. And I want to stop again on this and point this out. Because of the choice that Ruth made in this moment, God will then use her. He will have her remarry. He will have her have a son. He will have her son she will be the great grandmother of David. And from the line of David, Jesus is born. So the choice that Ruth makes to decide to choose God and stay in relationship with Naomi means that we go from a pagan foreigner to Jesus in one family line. One girl who the Israelites say grew up in the wrong place and worshiped the wrong way was given an opportunity to walk away from God, and instead, she made the choice to follow God, and because of that, we got Jesus. We can't ignore that because she literally changed everything for all of us. But Ruth doesn't know that in this moment. She is just standing there with Naomi, and she says, I'm going to stay with you. And Naomi doesn't know that either. She's like, I would not have made that decision, but here we go. I guess it's the two of us. And they didn't understand the significance of what just happened. And I think that's often what happens with us. We don't understand the impact our decisions might make. We just make decisions because life comes up. We have to decide what we're going to do in any given moment. We actually make a lot of decisions on a regular basis. We don't often understand the weight that some of our decisions can carry. It doesn't always feel that way. It probably didn't feel that way. I mean, Ruth knew she was like changing her life, of course, but she didn't understand all that was going to come. And a lot of times we just go through our life and we don't really understand all that God is going to do with those little everyday decisions that we make. But at the same time, he uses all of those decisions that we make. So here in this moment, here goes Naomi and Ruth off to Bethlehem. Once they get there, like I said, you guys know the end part of the story. But they don't know that yet. So we'll stay with them where they're at. They arrive in Bethlehem, and turns out without guys to help, you don't have food because you don't have income because, again, they're on their own. And so Ruth is like, okay, we got to survive. We've got to like figure this out. And so she's like, I mean, I know I said I chose God. I can't really like figure out what that means in this moment because we have to eat. So she wasn't really thinking like, I'm about to usher in redemption for all humankind. She's not really like in that moment. She's just trying to figure out how to survive. So here we see Ruth comes up with a plan in chapter 2, how she's going to get them food. Ruth the Moabite said to Naomi, let me go to the fields and pick up the leftover grain before anyone in whose eyes I find favor. Behind anyone. Naomi said to her, go ahead, my daughter. So she went out, entered a field, and began to glean behind the harvesters. As it turned out, she was working in the field belonging to Boaz, who was from the clan of Elimelech. So Ruth checks in with Naomi because now they're like in it together to the end. And she's like, I want this random field. I'm just going to go get some wheat because then we eat. It wasn't random to God, even though it was random to Ruth. Ruth was like, whoever is going to let me, I'm going to go for it. But God knew that that field belonged to Boaz. And Boaz was the person who could help these two women out. In the whole town of Bethlehem, out of all the fields that there were, had she picked any of the other ones, it wouldn't have worked out quite the same way. Ruth didn't seek him out. She wasn't looking for somebody to save her. She was just being faithful. She told Naomi she would stick with her. So she's like, here I am sticking with you, and I will figure out a way to feed us. And God guided what would happen after that. The things that I said we had make these everyday decisions. We're making decisions all the time. It doesn't always have to be big and revolutionary. A lot of times when we think about like doing something for God, we're like, oh, what is the big thing I could do where I'm like saving the world or helping all of the people? But Ruth wasn't doing that. She wasn't making the biggest and craziest decision. She was doing a normal thing, making sure they had food to eat, just living her everyday life. She didn't need it to be extraordinary. She just wanted to survive. And God was like, that's great. That's enough for me. I can do a lot with that because you said yes, because you moved. She didn't like sit at home and be like, I hope someone drops off food for us. She just moved forward and God used that. And her faithfulness was noticed. It was noticed by Boaz, the one person who could help them, whose field it so happened to be. He noticed her one day and he asked about her. And he knew what he had already heard about her at this point. Her reputation was a very big deal because she was foreign, she was alone, and she was with Naomi, who had been from there. And in chapter 2, Boaz says, I think it might be 3. I might have mistyped that. Boaz replied, I have been told all about what you have done for your mother-in-law since the death of your husband, how you left your father and your mother and your homeland, and you came to live with a people you did not know before. May the Lord repay for you what you have done. May you be richly rewarded by the Lord, the God of Israel, under whose wings you have come to take refuge. Boaz acknowledged that Ruth's life had collided with God. He in how she acted and the choices that she made, and he saw how God had impacted her life, how God had become her refuge. Refuge is that, by definition, being safe or sheltered from danger or trouble. And she had come to this place where she couldn't even necessarily worship and still had come to see that God would protect her, and her life showed it to people. How she was living her everyday life was showing people, oh, this is a God that Ruth trusts. Ruth's life shows God's impact, how God can impact us even when we are just living every day. The choices she made actually brought glory to his name and showed her, and she shows us, the way of participating in God's kingdom. A lot of times, if you would think about asking someone like Ruth, like, are you going to do something big for God? Are you going to participate in God's kingdom? I think she would have been like, yeah, probably not. I'm a Moabite. Like, I can't do that. Or she would assume, like, I'm just a widow. I barely have food to eat. I'm not really the kind of person that God would use. And we often think that I am not the person who can do something for God. I'm just a person. I just work a normal job. I'm just trying to, like, make it every day. I'm just trying to get the kids back to school, or I'm just trying to go back to school. But what's actually true for Ruth is true for us. We are the exact people that God has invited to participate in his kingdom work. Every single one of us. There is a next step. There is a decision before us. There is something that each of us can do to participate in God's kingdom that will further God's kingdom here on earth as it is in heaven. It doesn't have to be extraordinary. It doesn't have to be done on a stage. It doesn't have to be done before a king. In our quiet life, we can glorify God, find refuge in him, and proclaim his name to all people. And when we pursue God and we act in accordance with his will, he will then use that to further his kingdom. Like many of us, Ruth would have thought that she couldn't participate, but Ruth shows that participation in the kingdom of God isn't decided by your birthright or your bloodline, but by submitting yourself to God's will. Ruth shows that it doesn't matter where you're from, it doesn't matter your heritage, all of us have a part to play. We all learn to play our part through our faithful pursuit of our relationship with God. This is how it's talked about in the book of Romans. It says, through him we have received grace and apostleship to call all the Gentiles to obedience that comes from faith for his name's sake. So Ruth, as a non-Israelite, lived in the way that we are now encouraged to live, that it comes in the New Testament, before Jesus came to change the rules. Ruth did it first. She was like the original one. She's the one for all of us to look to. She learned from God. She sought refuge in him, and she obeyed. And that is the exact same thing that we are invited to do now. We learn from God. We also learn from trusted advisors. So Ruth is like new to Bethlehem. She doesn't really know, her way around town. She needed Naomi, just like we need trusted advisors to help us as we're following Jesus. So after Ruth had been faithfully getting wheat for them, like they're doing well, they're surviving, she had met Boaz, and he had been like, hey, I've heard about you. Then she shared with Naomi that Boaz had noticed her. She's like, hey, he knew about me. And Naomi was like, okay, that's great. Let me help you. I'm going to help you make a move. And this is what she says. One day, Ruth's mother-in-law, Naomi, said to her, my daughter, I must find a home for you where you'll be well provided for. Now, Boaz, with whose women you have worked, he is a relative of ours. Tonight he will be winnowing barley on the threshing floor. So wash, put on perfume, and get dressed in your best clothes. Then go down to the threshing floor, but don't let him know that you are there until he has finished eating and drinking. When he lies down, notice the place he is lying. Then go and uncover his feet and lie down. He will tell you what to do. I will do whatever you say, Ruth answered. So she went down to the threshing floor, and she did everything her mother-in-law told her to do. So she got dressed in such a way that would say that she's available, and she pretty much went and proposed marriage to him. So Naomi, I'm just going to say it that way, Naomi encouraged Ruth, you don't have to wait for him to make the first move. And she exercised her agency as an independent woman, and she pursued Boaz in a society that did not ever do that, like ever. So if Ruth did it back then, ladies, feel free. It's biblical, appropriately. Boaz is like, hey, this seems great. So he had no issues with that because he had seen Ruth and who she had shown herself to be, and he was like, that's the kind of woman I would like to be with. And so there was a whole thing where he had to check with another person and all that, but Boaz is an upstanding citizen, and he handled that really well in a way that honored the Lord. And then they got to move forward in their relationship. So Boaz took Ruth, and she became his wife. When he made love to her, the Lord enabled her to conceive, and she gave birth to a son. The women said to Naomi, "Praise be to the Lord. May he become famous throughout Israel. He will renew your life and sustain you in your old age. Your daughter-in-law, who loves you and who is better to you than 7 sons, has given him birth." The people of Israel, the people of Bethlehem, in a time where women were not honored, saw what Ruth had done and honored her for her faithfulness and her love for Naomi. And in all of it, they gave God the praise. They knew that God was involved in Ruth's life and Naomi's life, and that God had moved because of their faithfulness. So one foreign woman on the outside of a society is the one who redeemed Naomi's life, who guarded it and took care of it, ended up having a baby who goes in the same line of family to King David, who goes then to the line that's Jesus. Ruth's place in the ancestry of David shows all nations will be represented in the kingdom that Jesus ushered in. It is not a mistake to God. God knew exactly that would happen, and he did it on purpose because he knew he wanted to be a God for everyone. That his goal was one day more than Israel. It was all people. So he made it so we can't miss it. He's like, hey, look, I have Ruth in there. I have all people represented, all nations and all people. And I don't know why it had to happen exactly that way for Ruth, like why it couldn't have been her first husband, why she had to go through heartbreak, why she had to leave her hometown. I don't know. But what I do know is that somehow in the middle of the desert, after her first husband died, a widow, a foreigner, an outcast, chose God. And Ruth decided then and there that he would be her God. And that went on to change the world. So when you look at yourself and you think like, I don't know if there's much that I can actually do for the kingdom of God. I don't know, like, I feel like not me because I'm not qualified. Remember, it doesn't have to be extravagant. It doesn't have to be extraordinary. It doesn't have to be anything. It just has to be willing to listen to God, to let him be your refuge, to make decisions before you that point to Jesus. Ruth's story wouldn't have been part of God's story if she just sat and waited for everything to knock on her door. But she didn't. She went forward and lived her life, and God used what she did to bring his kingdom to earth. So like Ruth, we're all invited to participate in God's kingdom. So can you imagine with me what the world could be like if we all did participate in God's kingdom the way that Ruth chose to? If we took our ordinary everyday life and made it so it would glorify God, if our decisions were based on what was best for all people, if we were looking at like, I don't need to do anything crazy, I just need to be faithful. Can you imagine how we could impact the world for Jesus if we focused on God being our refuge and God being our provider and faithfully walked that out? What if we just ignored what society said about us and did the thing that God put on our hearts today? That he showed us what it is that we need to do today. And then he shows us what we need to do tomorrow. We could actually change the world. So I want to invite you guys to read the entire book of Ruth this week. It's real short. It's only a few chapters, so you can definitely do it. And as you read it, ask God a couple of questions. Do I relate to Ruth in any way? Have I felt like an outsider? Have I felt like someone who would automatically be disqualified from serving God in some way? And is there something that God is asking from me? Is there a decision that I need to make that I could make in such a way that would glorify Him and be for His kingdom? And also think about, would you have stayed in Moab? Would you be like me, who you have a personality, you're like, I don't like surprises, and I would have probably stayed in Moab, and then God would have still done something, but I wouldn't have been a part of it? Or could I have made a decision that allows me to be a part of what God is doing? So I want to ask us this week, how do we follow Jesus, and how can we best be used for His kingdom in our everyday lives? Let's pray. Lord, thank you so much for your word and for the story of Ruth, for the story of this woman who just wanted to survive, but wanted to survive with you. That she wanted you to be her refuge, that she wanted you to be her strength, that God, that she wanted her relationship with Naomi to be an important one in her life and not one that she left behind. So God, would you show us what it is that you have for each of us? Would you show us what decisions are before us that you want to do something with? The ways that you want to move, that the ways that we try to disqualify ourselves, you're not interested in because you want to use us. Lord, would you show us what you want to do through each of us this week? God, and we thank you that we are people who can participate in your kingdom. It doesn't matter who we are or where we're from. That doesn't matter what people say about us, or if we're an outsider or an insider, that you want us to participate in your kingdom, God. And we are thankful for that. We're thankful that you use people, thankful that you use us. We're thankful that our everyday life, it doesn't have to be crazy, and just be for you, Lord. So thank you for the opportunity we have to serve you every day. And God, would you just show what you have for each of us, to each of us today? In your name, amen.